ever found yourself facing expenses while working for a company without receiving a reimbursement? It's a scenario more common than you might think, and it can leave you feeling as if you're shouldering an undue burden. Our aim today is to guide you through the process of claiming tax deductions for these unreimbursed work expenses. This is a topic that affects a wide range of employees, from those in corporate office settings to those working in more unconventional environments. And here's the good news. Understanding how to navigate this issue can result in significant savings when tax season rolls around. We're here to demystify the process, breaking down the steps you need to and offering tips to ensure you're maximizing your potential deductions. It's all about putting you back in control of your financial situation. So if you've ever yourself in this situation, stay tuned. We've got a wealth of information to share. Like it, share, comment, and tell me what you want more information on. Don't forget to subscribe to stay informed. First, let's define what we mean by unreimbursed work expenses. Picture this scenario. You're working for a company, and during the year, you find yourself spending your own money on things directly related to your job. However, your employer doesn't reimburse you for these expenses. This is what we're talking about when we say unreimbursed work expenses. Now, you might be wondering what kind of expenses could fall into this category. Well, there are quite a few. For instance, imagine you have to travel for work. And you're not just talking about your daily commute. You have to fly to a conference across the country, book a hotel room, and dine out. All of these are considered travel expenses. If your employer doesn't cover these costs, they are unreimbursed work expenses. Another common example is home office expenses. With the rise of remote work, many of us find ourselves turning a corner of our homes into a workspace. The cost of setting up this home office, from the desk and chair to the computer and printer, can be considered unreimbursed work expenses if your employer doesn't foot the bill. Let's not forget about professional development. Whether it's a course to enhance your skills, a workshop to stay updated in your field, or membership fees for professional organizations, these are all potential unreimbursed work expenses. Remember, the key point here is that these costs must be incurred in the course of performing your job duties. They aren't personal expenses, nor are they costs related to job hunting or changing professions. They're the necessary and ordinary expenses of doing your job, and your employer hasn't reimbursed you for them. Now that we understand what these expenses are, let's move on to how you can claim them on your taxes. Not all unreimbursed work expenses can be claimed as a tax deduction. This is a crucial piece of information to keep in mind when you're trying to navigate the waters of tax deductions. But how do you know which expenses are eligible? Well, let's dive into that. Firstly, the expense must be necessary and ordinary for your line of work. Now, necessary doesn't mean it has to be indispensable, but it should be helpful and appropriate for your job. On the other hand, ordinary implies that the expense is common and accepted in your profession. For instance, a musician buying a new instrument or a painter buying art supplies could be considered necessary and ordinary expenses. Secondly, the expense shouldn't be extravagant. You may be wondering, what does extravagant mean in this context? Well, it's subjective, but a good rule of thumb is to ask yourself, is this expense reasonable given my line of work? For example, a salesperson buying a luxury car solely to impress clients might be considered extravagant, whereas a modest car for the same purpose would likely pass muster. The third criterion is that your employer doesn't have a reimbursement policy. If your employer has a policy to reimburse you for the expense, but you simply didn't take advantage of it, then you can't claim that expense as a tax deduction. It's important to check with your employer about their reimbursement policies before you make any large purchases you're hoping to write off. Finally, the expense must be incurred during the tax year you're filing for. This means if you bought a new computer for work in 2023, you can't claim it as a deduction in 2024. Once you've determined that your expense is eligible, the next step is to calculate the amount you can deduct. Remember, navigating tax deductions can feel like a maze, but understanding the eligibility criteria is the first step towards finding your way. The amount you can deduct for unreimbursed work expenses is not always straightforward. But worry not. We're here to shed some light on the process. The first thing to understand is the 2% rule. This rule is pivotal in calculating your deduction. It states that only the portion of your unreimbursed work expenses that exceeds 2% of your adjusted gross income, or AGI, can be deducted. Let's break it down a bit. Your adjusted gross income is your total income minus certain adjustments. These adjustments could include things like student loan interest, alimony payments, or contributions to certain retirement accounts. Once you have your AGI, you will then calculate what 2% of that figure is. Let's imagine that your adjusted gross income is $50,000. 2% of this amount would be $1,000. This means that only the portion of your unreimbursed work expenses that exceeds $1,000 can be deducted. Now, let's say your unreimbursed work expenses for the year totaled $1,500. In this case, you could deduct $500 from your taxable income. That's the portion that exceeds the 2% threshold. However, it's important to remember that not all work expenses are considered equal in the eyes of the tax code. The expenses must be ordinary and necessary for your job. This means they must be common and accepted in your field of work and helpful and appropriate for your business. This might include things like union dues, professional society dues, or the cost of uniforms that can't be worn outside of work. It could also include the depreciation on a computer or cell phone required for your work, or even the cost of job search expenses within your current occupation. After calculating your deduction, the final step is to report it on your tax return. But remember, tax laws can be complex and change frequently. It's always a good idea to consult with a tax professional to ensure you're getting the most out of your deductions. Reporting your unreimbursed work expenses on your tax return is a critical step. Now that we've understood what unreimbursed work expenses are, confirmed our eligibility, and calculated our deductions, it's time to report them. This is done on Schedule A of Form 1040. So what is Schedule A of Form 1040, you ask? Well, it's the form where you itemize your deductions. Itemizing simply means listing each of your expenses separately rather than taking the standard deduction. Why would you want to itemize? It's a good question. Not everyone needs to itemize, but if your total itemized deductions are greater than your standard deduction, then itemizing can save you money, and your unreimbursed work expenses can be a part of these itemized deductions. Now, let's talk about the process. To begin, you'll need to gather all your records of these unreimbursed work expenses. This includes receipts, invoices, and any other documentation that proves your expenses. Remember, the IRS may ask for these documents, so it's crucial to keep them safe and organized. Once you have your records ready, you'll list each expense separately in the job expenses and certain miscellaneous deductions section of Schedule A. Add up all your expenses and write the total in the space provided. Then you calculate the amount you can deduct. This is where the 2% rule comes into play. You can only deduct the part of your expenses that exceeds 2% of your adjusted gross income. So if your AGI is $50,000, you can only deduct expenses that exceed $1,000. After you've calculated your deduction, you'll write this amount on line 21 of Schedule A. This amount gets subtracted from your taxable income, potentially reducing the amount of tax you owe. And there you have it. That's how you claim a tax deduction for unreimbursed work expenses. Let's quickly recap what we've covered today. We began with understanding what unreimbursed work expenses are. These are the costs you bear for your job, which your company doesn't pay you back for. We then moved on to figuring out who's eligible for this deduction. Not all expenses qualify, and not everyone can claim this deduction, so it's crucial to know the specifics. Next, we delved into the process of calculating the deduction. It's not always straightforward, and there are limits to consider, but with the right knowledge, it's a manageable task. Lastly, we tackled how to report this deduction on your tax return. It's a critical step because without it, you won't be able to benefit from these deductions. Remember, every penny counts when it comes to your hard-earned money. Don't let unreimbursed work expenses take away more than they should. Thank you for watching, and we hope you found this guide helpful.